let's start talking rigging. Rigging is the next step of us being able to do 3D animation. At this point, we have our characters modeled. We've gone and we've done our look work of texturing our character and the UV unwrapping involved in that. But before we go ahead and animate our character, we have to rig it. What is rigging? What is any of that? Well, if we have our little character here, this is just our little chibi character. To animate it, we have to give it an internal skeleton. And the internal skeleton is what you're seeing here now highlighted in green. Our internal skeleton allows us to control our mesh. Remember, our mesh of our character, our whole entire character model is just a bunch of polygons. It's just a combination of faces and vertices and edges, and inside of it, it's just hollow. If we want to say we want to bend the arm, we have to tell it what part is the arm. What amount of faces here are the arm? What amount of faces are the lower arm? What is the hand? We have to define those properties. And then we don't want to have to move around a bunch of faces each time we want to move the arm. We want to just be able to say, hey, every face we told that was the arm follows along. And it follows along to something nice and easy to control. So we're going to rig our character. And then we're going to skin our character, and then we can go about animating our character. So the rig provides that internal area that we're going to control. Our rig is made up of various bones or joints. You'll hear both names for them or combinations of names for them within there that give us the various sections of our figure. And in a little bit, we'll talk anatomy of a basic humanoid bipedal character and how we can simplify a very complicated human skeleton down into something that works for us in rigs. But basically, we're mimicking the most important bones inside of our figure here. So our rig is our internal skeleton that's going to be our control point. We then tell what part of our model follows along with what part of our rig with what bones by going through a process of skinning it. And in skinning, we attach our model to our bones, and we go in and paint in our skin weights. Let's just go ahead and showcase that. We paint in our skin weights, which says what faces follow what bones. We're not actually getting into skinning today. That's another lecture. Skinning can be fun. And by fun, I mean a little bit infuriating. But that's okay. We're just going to start out with our very first step, which is rigging. Then we'll move on and we'll go ahead and jump into skinning. And then we'll fine-tune everything by adding in some extra features, one of which are controls. Controls are all of these shapes that you see, and that allows us to have something very, very easy to select and move around so that we don't have to click inside the character to select the rig. We can just click on our various controls and be able to do things. There's also fun things that we can do and add in little slider bars that allows our character to do things like tap their toe or lift their heel or stand on their tiptoe and things like that. Rigging can be an incredibly complicated topic. And for some people, they love that. Their brain really loves rigging. And it might be you. Maybe you really didn't like texturing. It just didn't jive with you. You may get into rigging and you may love it. Rigging is an interesting aspect of problem solving and details and getting things right. I have a friend who absolutely loves rigging. It's her focus in the field. I'm going to be frank with you all. I don't love rigging. It's probably actually my least favorite part for the process. But it's essential, and even though I don't love rigging, and rigging is never going to be my focus, and honestly, if it wasn't for teaching you guys, I probably wouldn't rig often at all, I still recognize that rigging is important, because if I model and texture a character, it can be really great to have a rig to... Cat's back. It can be really great to have a rig to show off in animation. And if I want to animate, I've got to have a rig. It doesn't always have to be my rig, but I can make sure that I can do my own rig, and I can show off my own model, my own animation if I've got some basic rigging skills. And that's where I want you guys to get in this course. Just some very basic rigging skills. And then those things can become more complicated if it's an interest for you. Like everything else in this course, this is very bare bones introduction in this course. So a few things for us to first know before we get into any complication of rigging. First and foremost, we are going to want to go and finally change our mode. This whole time we've been by default in the modeling mode. Our mode is sitting underneath File, Edit, and Create there. We want to change that to rigging. And when we change that to rigging, we have a selection of a variety of different menu options now after Windows. So you need to change that so when I refer to skeleton or skin or constraints or whatever, you now have access to those menu options. Again, we changed our mode from modeling to rigging. We now have access to our rigging specific items. You're going to also want to just make your life easy and click on your rigging tab here in the quick select. Again, we were in modeling previously. We want to click on rigging. It gives us easy access to rigging items. And last but not least, we're going to want to open our outliner. Some of you have preferred to have your outliner open already. It's okay if you did, but now we're going to open it officially. We're going to go to Windows, Outliner. And that opens its own little window here. And I'm going to pull it until I have a strong blue line and pin it. You don't have to pin your outliner where I pinned my outliner. It's just where I like it. Your outliner shows you every single thing you got in your scene. You're always going to have some things in there, no matter if you haven't made a single thing in Maya, because you're going to have our default cameras, perspective, top, front, side. You're going to have the default light set, the default object set, and then anything that you've created. In this case, I've got everything tucked away in a hierarchy underneath here that are all of my controls and all of my joints and all of this crazy stuff. And that's why we need that's why we need the outliner open, because we're going to be needing to see our hierarchy, influence our hierarchy, and modify our hierarchy as we go through these processes of rigging and skinning and potentially even into animation. So you're going to want your outliner open. Once more, that is Windows, Outliner. Once we've done that, we're ready to actually start jumping into doing rigging. Again, rigging can be a frustrating process, but it's about going step by step. It's about taking over an overarching animation, an overarching ideas, an overarching anatomy, and start boiling it down. And as we get further into rigging, you'll learn more skills and more information about where to go. The other thing that we have to accept about rigging as we get into it is when you guys do return to your actual characters, you might have things that you do need to go back and modify in your modeling. You may need to add in some more edge loops or cuts or things like that. We talked about some of them, about adding in appropriate information on knees and elbows and things like that. And so there might be a little bit of back and forth. But again, you just have to understand while you're in these learning phases of 3D animation, it's just going to be a little bit of a cycle of that, and that's okay. Breathe through those frustrations and keep going. So here is a good old human skeleton figure. And this is not an anatomy lesson. We're not a biology class, so there are going to be things I'm going to simplify or generalize because they're all we need for our purposes. But we need to understand what's going on with a basic human or humanoid skeleton. So when we're looking at any sort of skeleton, we need to understand what is the point of locomotion. What is the base or root of the skeleton? And in just about every animal that we're dealing with, our point of locomotion is the hips. The pelvis is where everything is going to move from. If our upper body is bending, it's bending at our hips. If our legs are moving, they're rotating at the hips. Yes, the arms don't move from the hips, but the arms rotate at the torso, and the torso is rotating from the hip. The head rotates at the neck at the torso, but that's still rotating from the hips. Everything basically points back to the hips. So our hip, our pelvis area, is our root or base of our skeleton. So in Maya, when we're constructing a skeleton, we're always going to start with our first bone or our first joint. Again, those words are interchangeable as far as Maya is concerned. As far as the generalization of 3D modeling is concerned. We're always going to start with that being our first joint. And then we're going to move up and out and down, and we're going to move out to the legs and down the legs, and etc., until we have the whole skeleton done. But our hips are our primary place of locomotion. Now, our hips are basically this big open cavity, and they're a big open cavity because there's a whole bunch of organs that sit and settle in here, intestines and livers and things like that. Also, for good old people with uteruses who may have babies, that's where the baby gets to sit and pop out of. So our skeleton basically is, our hips are basically this sort of butterfly shape in humans. We don't care about the rest of this. This is just one solid bone. We only care about the center of hip. So basically down there at the pelvis area. Running up from there, we have all of the pieces of our spine and our vertebrae. And there's a lot of them. I forget the exact number, and I'm not going to take a moment to Google it. We have a lot of vertebrae. We don't care about modeling as many vertebrae as we actually have as humans because that level of nuance rarely matters in animation, unless we're doing something that is incredibly scientific based or has a really bizarre specific nuance of motion. Those are the times we may start to care about having the correct number of vertebrae. The number you need are entirely dependent on the amount of motion your character needs to achieve. And what we're looking at doing is putting in the vertebrae who sit basically between that point of the pelvis and where our chest area starts. Because once we start getting up to where the chest is actually connected, there's not a lot of movement that can go on there in our spine because they're connected to our ribs, and our ribs are connected loosely through cartilage and such not to our sternum, which is connected to our collarbones. All of this chest area is pretty locked in place. So our only real movement occurs in this very short space until we get up to the neck. And then we got some more movement to think about. So we don't care about putting in a bunch of vertebra because we don't have that movement happening. So again, it sort of depends on the range of movement you want. A common number that I see running around is putting about 3 in there. Some only put in 2. But if you think about a number 3, we can get a full bend with just 3 lines. That is, in all essence, a curve, and if things are skinned well, will look like a curve, and all we've got is 3 lines. So generally the max vertebra you need are 3. And then you've got your whole chest area, which is pretty much one big old lump. And our chest area pretty much locks in right around here where all of our sternum and collarbones meet up. Our collarbones are these little things right here. Our collarbones are attached through to our sternum and then over to our shoulder. And they're basically a point that helps control and rotate our shoulder and the muscles that power our shoulders. And we have quite a lot of muscles around our shoulders because of our bipedal throwing and things like that. Or rather, we have quite a number of sophisticated muscles in there. So that's about where we want to be. And then we need to go up into the neck. Same general rule of thumb with the neck. Pretty much the most you need in the neck is 3. Again, unless you're doing something really crazy or dealing with something with an incredibly long neck. So if you're dealing with a giraffe and you have some really complex bends, you may want to do all of the vertebra in the neck. Fun fact, we have the same number of vertebrae in our neck as giraffes do. Theirs are just much, much bigger. But we only need to deal with about 3 for the neck at most. Again, these are just the standard maximums of what you might be doing. The skull has no flexibility in itself. Yes, we have a jaw and things like that, but the skull is pretty much one big old piece. So we have our skull, and we can end that. So this is our main vertical line of the skeleton. A base of the hips, 3 or so joints up into the chest, one big old joint for the chest up until the collarbone, 3 or so little joints for the neck, one big one for the head. We want to always put the line that goes from the pelvis to the tip of the head in first, because this is a nice straight line. And what this nice straight line sets up for us is making sure that all of our rotations inside of Maya stay nice and vertical for these first joints and things like that. So we want to go vertically first. Otherwise, this first joint can go out of skew. And then instead of rotating things in nice square 90-degree angles, you're trying to rotate things in these really wonky angles, and it's just going to cause you frustration later. So a good rule of thumb is to go from hips to the tip of the head first, and then branch out to the limbs. So going down to our legs, we need to have a joint in, even though it's probably never going to do anything, running from the hips out to our legs, because our legs are not directly underneath the hips. They go out with our whole hip joint. This is a lot of tendons and muscular, and this is one of the places that we tend to fail as humans as we get older. The upper leg is just one big old bone until we get down to the knee. The knee is a ball and socket joint. The knee is our hinge joint here. The hips are a ball and socket joint. By that I mean that the hips can rotate until it runs into other body parts, basically almost 360. That's not true because we have ligaments that stop it. So it can't really do that, but a ball and socket joint has a full range of motion. We're obviously more limited to about 180 in the, that would be the X direction. And we're, depending on how flexible a person is, and by that I mean, if we're going back and forth, we can only go, the average person who's not completely that flexible can only go so far back and so far up. If we're going side to side, we can obviously be straight underneath us. The average person can probably go about yay high. Yes, there are very flexible people who can go a full 180 to bring it up. Within those properties. So we have quite a range of motion in this ball and socket joint. Our knee down here is a hinge joint, which means if we're looking at it from the side, it basically wants to bend in this direction, and that's it. There is a little bit of wiggle room left to right in our knee because we have our knee cap, which is floating above our knee, and some soft fluids and cartilage in there. But that's the basic gist. Going down, our lower leg is made up of 2 bones. But unless we have something really crazy going on in the leg motion, or we're really caring about deformation physics, and even then we may not deal with a bone, we can have just 1 bone for our lower leg. We end in our joint here going down into our foot. Now, our foot, again, depends on how much motion we have. And if you think back to previous animation courses and things like that, it's the same sort of thing. So looking at from the side of the joints, we usually have our toes, the ball of our foot, and the heel of our foot, and then we're up into the leg. So if you want to have a strong range of motion in your foot, you may have 3 joints, lumping all of your toes together as 1. If you need an incredibly high range of motion in the foot, you may go through and do all of the toes. If you don't need much motion in the foot, you may simplify it down into 2 joints, where you have the toes and the ball of your foot and the heel of your foot. The most basic, of course, would be just 1 joint for the foot. Depending on the exercise, depends on how many joints and bones you need. I'm just going to draw it as 1 to make life easy, because I'm drawing this with a mouse. Yeah, I'll leave that up there. And you would do this on both sides. You would do one side. We would go up and do the same side on the arm. Don't worry about the second leg. We have to go out for our collarbone. Whether or not your collarbone is skinned to anything, again, depends on your model, but when you go out there. We have another ball and socket joint in our shoulders. We do have an extra bone in our shoulder, which is our shoulder blade. It's this triangle right back here. But we don't need to in the general basic level of rigging. Go ahead and rig that. There are some rigs who may include something for the shoulder blade to get that deformation or that flexing that happens on the back. But we can just go out. Again, much like our legs, we've got the same setup. Our upper arm is a single joint, goes down into the hinge joint of our elbow. Our arm is the same two bones. Now, we have a lot more flexibility in our hand than our foot as far as rotation. Our foot is more locked because our foot has to be stable enough to hold all of our weight. Our hand needs to be dexterous enough to use all of our tools. So there can be a case, especially for deformation, where you may need to show these arm bones as two different bones. Because, and you can feel this on your arm, if you put your hand on either side of the widest part of your arms, and sort of clamp from that widest side around, and then you rotate your wrist, you can feel those bones shifting underneath your hand. As we rotate the wrist, those two bones shift and turn. And then we go down into our hand. Hand, again, depends on the amount of ability that you need. If you're going super lazy on a hand, you might just do one bone. Usually, though, we get a mitten hand effect. So we think of the palm as being all of one space. That'll be one bone. We think of all of our four fingers who come off of the palm as being three joints. Because if you feel your fingers, you can see that you've got those three joints in the fingers. And you would mimic the same sort of thing and control all of those fingers together as one. And then we would worry about our thumb as a separate entity. And our thumb comes off on its own thumb pad here. And from that thumb pad, we have two more bends. So you would have your thumb be, again, three little joints. So at its bare minimum, well, or at a lower minimum, you would do this mitten effect. So if you were wearing mittens, this is what your hand would move like. But a lot of times a hand is something that is important in a rig, and we may need to go through and rig it out. If we were going to rig this more complexly, what we would have is each finger would have these three joints. So we would have another 3 sets of these coming off of our palm. But usually, if you're going for the most basic level, this is a sort of rig you would do, and then again, you up the complexity from there. You guys will be doing a hand at some point, as warning. So again, depends on the level of complexity. But this is it. This is our rig. But wait, you say, why don't we have the other side? Well, if we do one half of our rig, we can just copy and paste it over to the other half. Assuming that we've modeled with symmetry on, a symmetrical copy and paste of our rig is still going to line up everything perfectly. This is another reason that modeling with symmetry is really your friend. But this is the basics of your skeleton for a rig. I might recommend that you screen cap this and keep it somewhere for your notes so that you have it available to you. But this is our basic setup. How, though, do we go about making that and utilizing that in Maya? Well, each one of these triangles that I've drawn represents one of our bones. And we're going to go in and stack up a model in a very similar manner. And that will become the basis for our rig. So the next part of this is talking about the technicalities of actually making a rig inside of Maya. So let's go back to our little chibi character here just because it's available for me to use as a demo. So whenever we're building our rig, we want to start out by building it in the front view. Then we're going to refine it from the side view to make sure it really lines up with the legs and the arms. Because there's a few tricks we want to make sure to implement. So we're going to be jumping between those, predominantly in the front view, occasionally to the side view, finishing in the side view, then mirroring. So we want to go ahead and look at this in our wireframe mode because we need to make sure that we're seeing into our figure. You can toggle between that with 4 and 5, or you can go up here and change it by clicking on the cube that is just an outline in your menu. So I'm just going to go ahead and pre-put both of those in wireframe so that I can see through what's going on. I highly prefer to turn off my grid because I don't want any extra complexity going on in the view. So our tool for making this happen is our joint tool here. It's the second one over in the rigging tab. It looks like these two triangles with dots connected them. I wonder why I was drawing triangles. Yes, our joints basically are a circle with a triangle in front of it. The circle of a joint at the bottom is where all of the rotation is happening from. So the pivot point of any joint is the circle at the fat end of a joint. It will then extend out into a triangle. And your very last joint must end at another circle. This circle you should never skin anything to. It is a dead weight. But it always needs to end at the start of another joint. And if we click on these, we can see this bottom one is named joint 1, and it is connected to joint 2. Why, yes, your joints will auto-connect themselves as long as they are part of the same string. So you don't need to go through and parent or constrain them or anything like that. They're going to connect themselves. So I want to go through here and start basically again at the pelvis area. So somewhere below the belly button. I want to go ahead and click the first joint, and this is going to be my hip joint. Now, on this chibi, things are a little distorted, as is the nature of a chibi. So we're going to say that the chest is somewhere up around here. So I want to go 1, 2, 3 or so to get up to that chest. So when I'm drawing this, I'm always going to look at my figure and sort of plan out what I want to do with my joints before I draw them. And I can go back through on any of these joints and move them around and adjust them. I'm not locked into where I click, but I want to make sure that I'm doing the best logical sense. So you should be thinking about your model before you start clicking around with joints. We go up to the collarbone area. Then in the neck, we're going to have 1, 2, 3 joints. I'm going to be lazy here because it's a tiny little neck and just make 1 joint. And then we're going to finish up at the top of the head. When I get to the top of the head, I'm going to hit enter so that my joint is locked in. All of them will turn green and they are done and put in there. Now, the sizing of your joint depends on what you've got going on. Let me start drawing a new joint here. Depends on what you've got going on with your radius. So you can control your radius over from the attribute editor, but we can also double click on the tool and we can control what our radius is for our various bone lengths and things like that. So we could increase the radius, and by increasing the radius, we get a bigger circle, basically. So if your joints are way too tiny to see, you're going to go into your tool by double clicking on it and increase your radiuses. If they're too big, you're going to go in and decrease them. Okay. So I've made my first set of my skeleton here. What I want to go ahead and then do is get back to my bone tool. Remember, your last tool used, if it's not currently highlighted, you can click Y to get back there. And we're going to go out and make the other joints. To do that, I want to click on whatever that root joint should be. So for the legs, I'm going to click down on this hip joint so it's highlighted green and active again, and then go out to the legs. Now the legs are where we need to pause and go over to the side view. We need to do something tricky in here to make sure a future step is going to work. And that trickiness is to add a tiny bit of bend to the leg in the natural direction of the leg. And by that, I mean I don't want to go straight down with the joint. I want to go a little bit forward towards the knee with the joint. And then when I get down to the ankle, I want to go back underneath the hips. I want a little bit of bend here because when we go and put in our IK handle, we'll talk about what that is, we need to basically pre-tell that joint where to bend. So go and make sure when you're doing that, you put in a little bit of bend in the direction of the knee and the leg. And then you go out and figure out how many joints you need for your foot. Hit enter, locks that in. We're going to go back here to the front and we're going to start by clicking Y so our tool is active again. Click on the collarbone. Everything up from there will turn green. We want to do this on the same side as we did the leg. Apparently, I'm defaulting to doing it on the left side of the screen. Doesn't matter which way you do it. We're going to go out to where our shoulders are for our collarbone. You notice I'm basically putting these in the center of the joints. And we need to do the same thing for the arm. Now, for the arm, it can be a little tricky to get that bend in. You can certainly do it on the side view. You can do it on the front view, kind of. It depends on which way your character's elbow is facing. In this case, my character's little elbow is basically facing, let me confirm that. Yes, it's basically facing up. So I can pretty much do this from the, wait, is that true? No, elbow's facing back. So I want to make sure that my joint is a little bit towards the elbow. So it's actually going to be a little bit easiest for me to do it from the top view just because of where my character's elbow is facing. Whatever view lets you see the elbow, we're going to do the same thing as the knee. My joint I'm creating at the elbow needs to go a little bit back towards it. And then my other joint is going to be back centered in line with the shoulder. Then we would go through and do whatever we need to do with the hand. And you'll notice my arm has gone awry here as far as my front view is concerned. That's okay. I can go through and move these. So I could do one joint all the way at the top, press enter. If I did need to do a thumb, same thing, click the Y key, click on the thumb, and I could put in whatever joints I need for the thumb. So wherever you need to restart a joint, we can go ahead and restart a joint. We can just click on it, and that now is the root that we're building off from. Once I have everything drawn, this is when I need to go in and rotate my joints. We can just use our general rotation tool for that to get everything in place. We need to make sure at this stage that everything is sitting inside of our skin, with the exception of our very last joint. Our very last joint can sit outside of the skin. I like to think about it as that middle line of the joint sitting at the very top or edge of that mesh. So like I might go and move out the fingers a little bit. This is a stage that in the real world, you are going to take a good 15-20 minutes really working these around. And making sure that they're sitting well, that your elbow is really sitting at the elbow, the knee is really sitting at the knee, everything's contained, zooming it in and out. You really want to get close and look at this and make sure it's functioning well. I'm just going to keep going quickly to move things along. So now we want to go ahead and mirror this so that I get the other leg and the other arm. So I'm going to click down on my hips because it's my base root. I'm going to go up to the skeleton tab. I'm going to go to mirror joints, but I'm going to click on the option. Where our joints are mirrored and what axes they're mirrored across, you're going to have to control by clicking on which axis set you want to mirror on. In this case of a character who's modeled from the front and symmetrical from the front, this YZ is serving for me. It's not the default, but that's the one that works for this specific model. Good news is if it's wrong, you can just undo it, go in here, try a different one. But with the right axis selected, I can go ahead and click mirror, and now that you can see my joints are all mirrored within our properties. And something went a little bit wrong there. Let me try that again. I realized what went wrong. I was using an old process. Okay, correction, and I apologize for this. You don't want to select at the hip, otherwise it will duplicate your whole center skeleton, which is what I noticed for something going wrong. We want to click out one from the root. So, for example, we want to click out here where the leg is, specifically. Go to skeleton, mirror the joint. It will auto-correct to whatever your closest root is that other one is connected to. Go up and click on the shoulder, skeleton, mirror joints. It will auto-connect. You can tell everything is connected by if you clicking on your root, everything turns green to say, hey, all of this is highlighted. So I apologize for that misstep. Brain was running through a node process. You want to click on whatever your joints are that are one separated from the root you want them to connect to. So for the hips, you don't want to click on that. You want to click on the actual leg joint. For our chest here, you don't want to click on that. You want to click on the actual shoulder joints. Once everything is connected, though, we're good. So when we get down into the future, you would then take this skeleton and you would also select your mesh and you would go to skin, bind skin. Your joints turn rainbow because it's got an order of hierarchy now. It auto puts skin together and voila, we now have a character that is rigged to move. We are not going to get into skinning yet because painting skin weights can get complicated and again, they can be frustrating. So we've got our lovely little figure here who looks a little bit like a gnome. And when you're animating in this manner, what you have is forward kinematics. And that means everything is moving from the root location, in this case, our hip. So if we move our hips, everything moves with it. So if we wanted this character to take a step, we would need to move the hips forward. Then we would need to go back to the leg that we wanted to stay in place. And we'd need to rotate the leg backwards. And we would need to rotate our other leg as need be. And that can get really potentially tedious. As you guys will know from the spider bot, your spider bot was basically rigged with forward kinematics. So you will be doing an example of a walk cycle with a forward kinematics so that you know how it feels with a bipedal character. And then you're going to be taking this same rig and this same setup, except we're going to go over and add in IK or inverse kinematics. What inverse kinematics means, just to put one in really quickly, is that if I move the foot, the rest of the leg is going to move with that foot. So I can position all of what I need by going through with that foot as the forward point. That one's not IK'd. With the foot as the forward point. And IK makes a lot of things easier, such as grabbing for an object, but there's also some things that it makes worse. A good rig, you have the control to switch between an FK and an IK, or forward kinematics and an inverse kinematics, and it makes life a little bit easier. How do we put in a inverse kinematics or an IK handle? Well, it's our third tool over in our rigging tab, and it is incredibly simple. You click on the joint closest to the root, and then the other joint you want to connect it to. And there are various places in a body that you may put in IKs, and we will be looking at more complex IK examples in the future. But if we're doing basic IKs, we want one in each leg and one in each arm. And for our leg, and please make sure that you get this, and if need be, write down notes, because inevitably there's always one of you who tries to connect IKs to the wrong joints, even though we go over it repeatedly. So please make note of this. We want to do the leg. This is the whole leg, not the foot, not the spine, the leg. So we need to go from the piece of the leg closest to the root. The root for our legs is our hip. The closest one is the top of the upper leg here. The lowest part of our leg is the ankle. So you click on your hip, and then you click on your ankle. It automatically makes the IK. Now let's talk about the anatomy of this IK. There's a few things that are made. There is the IK running through our joints, and this is why we want to pre-bend the leg. It tells our IK which to bend, and you can see that bend in here on the left side of this green line. Then there is the actual IK handle, which is basically the line connecting our ankle to our hips. You can basically think of this as a piece of elastic. And then we have this circle with this big white line through it, which is defining where forward is for our IK. If we pre-do the bend in the leg and in the elbows, this should always point the right direction. If you don't pre-do the bend, this may be pointing the wrong direction. And if this is pointing the wrong direction, we have to do a whole bunch of fun selecting and going in and dealing with some things therein. We can also do some really fun things about where that is pointing, though, for later, more complicated parts of a rig. But if you put that bend in normally, everything will be happy. And our IK should behave, for the most part, pretty well until we get past the point of common sense and our IK starts folding on top of each other, and then things are going to go wonky. But we can't physically do that anyways. This is probably about as much as we could put a leg up at the highest level, and it all behaves. You should always test an IK after you make it, and make sure everything goes right within that process. I just undid all of that. And that testing is as simple as, let's click on our joints. Hi. That testing is as simple as going boop boop. Okay, it works. Control Z, Command Z if you're on a Mac, and you're good. You would do this for both legs. Actually making sure you click on the right things. I'm having trouble with that today. Test it. Okay, we're good. Control Z. Then go up to the arms. Same logic with the arms. We just want to do the arms. We're not caring about the hand or the chest or the spine. So the closest place to the root for the arms is the chest, is the shoulder joint. So we would click first on the shoulder, then we would click on the wrist. And again, we can test that to make sure things are bending in the right direction. And they are. We would then go over and do it to the other shoulder. Make sure everything's happy. And this sets up our IK rig. We now have a IK rig, or inverse kinematics rig, which means that as we're moving things around and controlling where things are shifting, we can move from the IK. Now, to move it from the IK, we're going to move the IK handle. If you look over here in my outliner, and at this point in the semester, you should basically be leaving your outliner open all the time. We have our IK handles. We would want to name our IK handles things that make sense. Please note, when you are naming things, even if you are looking at it in this way, you name it with the characters left and right. So this may be on the right side of my screen, but this is the left leg. You always want to name it with the character, because no matter which way you're looking at it, the character's left leg is always their left leg. It doesn't change no matter what side of the screen it's on. So you would want to go through and name these things that make sense so you can easily select them. You can select it by clicking on the little edge of it here, but honestly, it's just so much easier to select in the outliner. Same thing with all of your joints. It's so much easier to select those in the outliner. So get used to selecting things from the outliner and naming things appropriately. You're going to do an IK rig and then go through and animate everything from an IK perspective. And so that you can understand and see the difference between a FK motion and an IK motion. Make sure that at this point, at the end of this week, you are comfortable with a rig setup, you are comfortable with mirroring a rig, and you are comfortable with putting in IKs, and your IKs consistently work well. And by that I mean 9 out of 10 times your IKs are good and happy. If you are lower than that ratio, you need to come for virtual office hours or reach out to me so that I can help you with this. If you do not have this lecture down at this week, you're going to be behind and you're going to struggle to catch up, and you are not going to do well on the second project. So if you do have any questions or concerns or consideration, or this just didn't click with you, please reach out to me, especially during virtual office hours, so that I can assist you with these topics and look at what you're doing wrong so that I can help you through those. So reach out if you need help. Do this a few times if you need to do it a few times to cement it in your brain, because going forward, we're going to be looking at more advanced concepts. All right, good luck.